Public CEO Report is a podcast that provides insights about the public sector and public policy for the benefit of decision makers and leaders powering our communities. I'm your host, Ryder Todd Smith, and today we're joined by Chris Skinnell, partner at Nielsen Merksamer, and Doug Johnson, president and founder of National Demographics Corporation. Chris and Doug, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ryder. Nice to be here.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so let's talk about CVRA and redistricting and the census. That's what this podcast is going to be all about. First, a little bit of background. Chris, tell us a little bit about your background, what you do, what your specialty is, and about Nielsen Merksamer.
Yeah, by way of background, we kind of got interested in redistricting as a student at Claremont McKenna College, and did a little bit of redistricting work while I was there. And then went to law school and, ended up working at the one firm in California that does redistricting work on the legal side. So I've been here ever since I got right out of law school. Nielsen Merksamer is a full-time political law firm, one of the leading political law firms in California. We do pretty much anything related to public policy. We have a lobby practice in Sacramento. We represent companies and local governments who have to deal with public policy issues in Sacramento. And, we do litigation. We do sort of a broad swath of general government political law work.
All right. And how many public agencies could you guesstimate that you've worked with on districting or voting rights issues or things of that nature, just for some context?
We were trying to figure out, it's somewhere in the ballpark of 200 plus. Over the last decade.
So more than one.
More than one, more than two. We've been doing a lot of this stuff for 40 plus years. So, if you start going that far back, it's hundreds and hundreds. But just in the last 10 years, it's probably about 200 or so.
Okay. All right. And then Doug, let's hear a little bit about your experience and focus area and what you do at National Demographics Corporation.
Sure. Similar to Chris, I got started in this as an undergrad at Claremont McKenna, actually the same professor that Chris had later on, and the same Rose Institute, state and local government, where we all got our start. So got hooked on the issue, graduated from college, went off and did different things for a few years, got an MBA and worked a couple of jobs. And then when 2001 came around, I actually came back and started working for our old professor at National Demographics in what started as a part-time job while the tech boom collapsed in 2001, and 20 years later I'm still here. So NDC is a firm that works for local governments, all kinds of local governments, similar to Nielsen Merksamer, cities, schools, water districts, airport districts, fire protection districts. We help all those with demographic studies, districting, and redistricting projects all over California and Arizona.
All right. And I'll ask you the same question. How many cities have you had the opportunity to work with as a demographer dealing with either district formation or redistricting activity?
For cities, we're at about 140, maybe getting close to 150. And altogether, I actually went back and looked recently. Since I came back in 2001 to the company, we've worked with 368 jurisdictions on districting and redistricting projects.
Look at that precision, Doug. Just what I want to hear from a demographer is precision.
Exactly.
That's right. And this is why lawyers go to law school, so we don't have to do math.
So one thing too, we should just talk a little bit real quick, the Rose Institute, because you both mentioned the Rose Institute. I should also note that, like both of you, I also attended Claremont McKenna College. So there's a little bit of a CMC mafia going on here. Like both of you, I was also involved with the Rose Institute of State and Local Government. Chris happens to be on the board of the Rose Institute. Doug, you are a fellow at the Rose Institute. I am also on the board at the Rose Institute. So the Rose has a history of being involved with demographic work and districting and district formation processes and voter education information about the districting process and redistricting activity, particularly around the State Redistricting Commission. So it's kind of a hive of that activity, and that's probably one reason why the three of us have all come out of that space and have landed in this area many years later after our time at CMC. So it's a great place to learn about. In fact, let's talk a second about that. We'll segue actually into the Rose Institute a little bit, just because we're going to talk about the conference that we all participated in back in September. But we just finished 2020, which had many characteristics to it, which includes theoretically a census that is delayed in getting its data out, but should have been completed. And so that triggers a bunch of activity. So maybe Chris, could you talk real quick? What does the census trigger in 2020 in terms of redistricting activity?
Yeah, so basically any jurisdiction that elects its governing board member by districts in any method other than at large has to redraw its lines every 10 years to make sure that they're population balanced. And then within that sort of constraint, they got to make sure they comply with federal voting rights laws. And then there are various state laws, depending on the type of jurisdiction you are, talking about what other things you need to take into account. And so every, cities and counties and special districts and school districts, they all have different processes they have to follow, different timelines. They all have different considerations. But the end goal is eventually to have all of their lines redrawn for their next election, generally for 2022, maybe in a couple cases 2023 if they're odd year, although there aren't very many of those left.
So that is generally going to prompt a flurry of activity for existing by district local government agencies to have to redraw their lines over the next 14 to 18 months?
Well, less in most cases. Most cities and counties are going to have to be done, counties by the end of this year, okay, and cities mostly by next April, except for that select few that has, again, the 2023 elections. So, yeah, and there are even a few cities that currently are at large, but have made the decision that they're going to draw districts now to transition into them for the next election also. They've been threatened with litigation or what have you, and decided that they're going to abandon their at-large system, but they've been waiting for the census to draw lines because it didn't make sense to do it based on 10-year-old data. Yeah.
So, and maybe Doug, if you could comment on that. So there are, and generally speaking, there are a ton of agencies, and we'll come back to this in a second. There are a ton of agencies that have all gone to by-district elections over the last 10 years since the last census, which is going to create a real crunch in 2021. But that a number of those agencies may have just gone to by-district elections 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Why, even though they only did it a couple of years ago, they are likely going to have to go through a redistricting process anyways. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. For all of its problems, the decennial census, whether it's 2010 or 2020, is considered kind of the golden number. It's the best survey out there of population counts. So that's what the law turns to when we're talking about equal numbers of people in each district. So even when a city or school district or whoever goes through this in 2017 or 2018, they're still using, for the most part, 2010 census data to figure out their total populations for each election area. So even though they just went through it, some jurisdictions just went through it in 2020, they still have to redraw their lines to reflect the new census data. The good news is once they redraw the lines using the new data, those lines can be in place for 10 years. Mm-hmm. It's just the quirk of the first time they did the transition was late in the decade. And we always hear about different population estimates from the state or from the Census Bureau. Those are generally all large geography, often whole city numbers. They're not the small geography detailed numbers that we need to actually draw lines within a city. So the state can tell us how much a city has grown from year to year, but it doesn't tell us where in the city that growth happened. And if we don't know which part of the city had the growth, then we can't adjust the lines for it.
All right.
So it's all about the decennial census data.
And when you engage to go into the redistricting process itself, there is kind of an early stage review or calculation using some of the data to make a determination about the need to redistrict. Is that correct?
Yes. As soon as the new data comes out, the first thing we'll do is a giant run for all of our clients of the new census numbers compared to their existing lines. And for a small, lucky few jurisdictions, their existing lines will still be population balanced. And if they want to adjust them, or we'll talk later about this new Fair Maps Act, if they need to adjust them to meet the Fair Maps Act, they can do that. But they do have that option of keeping the old lines if they're one of those lucky few. But right. Historically, that almost never happened in California because California was always growing, given the fact that California hasn't grown for the last 10 years, maybe we'll see more falling into that category.
Okay. And I think, so now let's take a step back, because the other thing that's just generally happening is it's a crunchier, and crunchier more so than 10 years ago in 2011, when there was a bunch of redistricting to be done, or some redistricting to be done on the local government level. The last 10 years has seen a sea change in the number of local government agencies that have moved to by-district elections, and their underlying root element of this, and I'll defer to our attorney on the call here, is fundamentally the California Voting Rights Act, or CVRA, and evolution of that law. Chris, could you talk a little bit about that and the impact it's had in terms of the shift to by-district elections in local government?
Yeah, so in 2002, the legislature passed the California Voting Rights Act. You know, we've had the Federal Voting Rights Act going back to the 1960s, and it was always a method for challenging at-large elections if certain criteria could be met. But it's a very labor-intensive way to do it. It, you know, requires very complicated litigation. And so the California legislature adopted its own version in 2002 that, you know, had the purpose or the goal of streamlining that effort. Making it easier for plaintiffs to challenge at-large voting. And as a result, you know, you've seen a whole host of letters going out to cities, counties, well, one county, cities, school districts, saying, hey, if you don't voluntarily make the switch from at-large voting to districts, we're going to sue you to make you do it. And early on, there were a few cities and county that resisted that, and they were not successful. And so the general trend now is for most cities and other jurisdictions to make the change voluntarily. But, you know, as a function of all of this, well, Doug, you're the one who's kind of been keeping count, but I think there were, I want to say maybe 100 local government entities in 2010 that had to do this, and now I'd guess there's 500, you know, so a five-fold increase, which means, you know, and I should say, you know, the demographers of the world, Doug, and law firms that do it, there hasn't been a five-fold increase in those. So it's going to be a little bit of a hectic year, but and then on top of that, you throw in the fact that now the legislature's adopted rules that require more hearings, more outreach, everything else. It's each single one is a more labor-intensive process besides.
Yeah. So Doug, could you talk a little bit about those changes in the numbers?
Yeah, I would add to that. Chris is right. The numbers were, you know, up to around 500 jurisdictions in the state that have to do this. The other twist is that a separate act by the legislature essentially got rid of off-year elections. So there, as Chris mentioned, there are a handful that still have odd-year elections, but in 2011 there were a lot. And so we actually had really 2 years to get done those 100 or so jurisdictions 10 years ago. Now almost everyone has moved to even years. So we have, you know, almost 500, or I think we might be a little over 500 now, jurisdictions that have to go through this process, and now they all have to do it. And what we had been hoping would be a year-long window, April to April. But as we'll talk about, the census data is late. So those 500 jurisdictions are getting more and more jammed together, unfortunately.
Well, let's. Well, we should segue to that right now. I mean, I know we had it on some of our things we wanted to cover when we planned for this conversation, but we're sitting here. This is early February that we're recording this right now for anybody who's watching. What is the latest update on when census data is? When is it normally released, and when does it appear to be like it's going to be on track? And ultimately, moving through the state processes, when do we think it's actually going to be available for a demographer like yourself to use?
Welcome to my nightmare. So the data that we need for redistricting, which is the localized demographic data, is supposed to be released before April 1st. That's the federal law. But with COVID and all the chaos that surrounded both COVID and DC politics in the last year, that was delayed. We had been hoping it would be delayed maybe 6 weeks, and we'd get our data in mid-April, or I'm sorry, mid-May. Mm-hmm. And we just last week learned, at the very end of January, the Census Bureau announced that they will release the data no sooner than July 31st. So we're at least 4 months late. And, you know, the wording is pretty clear. It's not going to come out July 31st. It just won't come out any sooner than that. So that happened last Wednesday. Then on Thursday, the California Statewide Database, which has the second step in this process, announced that they are going to need 30 days to process that data. So their job under state law is to take the state prison populations that the Census Bureau just counts in the prison and to reallocate all those numbers back to their home addresses. So the prisoners will be counted at their last known address, not in the prison itself. So we're looking at, mid-August, getting the data from the Census Bureau, and if the state sticks to that timeline, mid-September, actually getting the data that we're required to use to draw the lines, instead of March 31st.
Well, and then compounding that for cities and counties at least, the new legislation that got passed last year, AB 1276, requires a 3-week delay between the release of those adjusted data, the prisoner adjusted data, and the first map being released by a jurisdiction that's doing districting. So, you get your initial census data in mid-August, you get your statewide database adjusted data in mid-September, and now you're looking at the second week of October before you can start releasing maps. And for counties, they got to be done by December 15th the last date. So, you maybe have 2 months to do this whole process, a bunch of hearings and everything, all the outreach and everything else. So it's getting pretty scrambled at this point.
Yeah, I'll add to that, especially with the spread of independent commissions. Santa Barbara County has their first ever independent commission. They have to hold 7 hearings after the draft maps are released. So, if the draft maps can't be released until October, and they have to finish December 15th, that's a really tight time frame to get 7 hearings done.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys are not planning on sleeping once September rolls around. You just plan on being awake throughout until Christmas. Is that the plan?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the problem actually, it's not even us that has the issue. It's, public agencies only meet at certain times, right? So if it were up to me and I could stack one meeting after another 8 hours a day, that'd be great. But no, they all meet at, 6 o'clock on Wednesday night. So, you'll have 35 jurisdictions all doing a hearing at the same time, sometimes in the same town, right? You might have a city and then the county and then the local school district all having hearings. So it's going to be frantic for us. I think it may be confusing for the public as well as a result of that.
Yeah, and that is the downside. It's the part of this puzzle that loses out the most when time gets squeezed is the time for public participation. Is the time for the public to go off and draw their maps. That's in particular where we're hoping that the statewide database can reduce its 30 days down and do that faster, so that we can save some of that time for the public to actually be participating and talking in this process more than they'd be able to if we only had 6 weeks to finish the whole thing.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Doug, but I don't think I've ever done a single redistricting in my entire life where someone didn't come in and complain that they didn't have enough time. Right. It's just you could be doing it for an entire year, and you'll get to the last couple of meetings, and someone will come in and say, "Hey, why are you rushing?" So, it's just going to be compounded.
Yeah.
So, and of course, Chris, you refer to the fact that you also have a lobbying arm that operates out of Sacramento, and I know there's been some, I guess maybe hope is the starting point about any legislative remedies that may reduce this compression and out of a good public policy and kind of recognizing a stark reality of what's on the ground right now. Probably very early to tell given the start up of the legislative session right now, but I'll just throw it out there. Is there anything to report or discuss on that?
Nothing concrete. There's rumors kind of circulating that something might be pursued, but I don't think there's anything concrete as of this point that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and the biggest challenge is, of course, for the state redistricting commission. They have to draw Assembly, State Senate, Congressional, and Board of Equalization lines for the whole state.
Yep.
And they're not going to get their data until mid-September. Their original deadline was August. The court has already pushed that back, I believe, to December, but still they've got to do all that state work in 2.5 months,
right,
with Thanksgiving in the middle of it. So
yep.
This is going to be brutal. And of course, the challenge is that, these things are all written into statutes, and, it would take emergency legislation to change a statute mid-year. So it puts everyone in a real spot, that's for sure.
Well, if Sacramento has gotten good at one thing in 2020, it was all sorts of emergency legislation and emergency action. So maybe that'll be a silver lining that comes out of the 2020 experience.
Yes, exactly.
All right, so you've just painted this grim picture, and there are now clerks at school districts and special districts, other special districts and cities that are going, great, sky is falling, this is chaos. What should those, I mean, those folks, often the city clerk is the leader, or the clerk of the organization is the leader at the agency on this kind of program and effort. What should they be doing right now? Like, what's the professional advice you both have for them to be doing here in the month of February, staring down this roadmap that's not going to make data available and map drawing available until September, for example?
I mean, I think there's a couple steps you can take. First, I'll toot our horns, Doug. Hire your consultants now. Get them lined up, so you're first on the list. But there are some preliminary steps that you can be taking before the data come out, right? Especially cities and counties, they have to conduct at least one and, can do more public hearings before the maps get released. Because, you're supposed to use that as an opportunity to help identify communities of interest and other things that should be taken into account in the process. They don't rely on having a map on the table per se, although I will say, as a practical matter, sometimes having that map is helpful to guide those discussions, but it's not essential. And so, those jurisdictions can buy themselves a little bit of time by getting those preliminary steps wrapped up before August, when the data come out, so that all they have to do at that point is they get the draft maps out as soon as possible, and then they just have the second half of the process to deal with, right? Instead of compressing it all into those 2 months. It's not an ideal solution. Things will still be rushed, but at least it takes a little bit of pressure off, and it gives the public, I think, a little bit of lead time to start processing the idea that this is going on, so they're not caught quite as flat-footed. Again, they'll say it's also rushed, but it won't be as much.
I'm not sure we would disagree with them that it's being rushed. Unfortunately, it's just the circumstances are forcing the rush on it, but making the best out of a speedy situation is really the best an agency can do, right? So front loading some of that stuff. I would agree with that point as a communicator. The more you can do to get some of that education seeded into the minds of your public in a very esoteric issue earlier, the more likely they're going to be in a position of success to be responsive and engaged in the map drawing process when that ultimately manifests. Because if they start that process thinking about it that late into the game and you're rushing, like they're already playing catch up in a situation where they don't really have to be if you're proactive in some of these efforts. Doug, did you have some additional thoughts to offer?
Yeah, we work a lot with the vendors of the various software packages. Obviously, we do so many projects that we generate a lot of business with them. So as soon as the Census Bureau announcement came out, we reached out to them and started saying, hey, this is going to be different than we thought. And we'd always said, let's wait for the official data to have people start drawing lines, because you hate to draw lines and then they turn out to be not balanced because the estimated data was different than the official data. But given that the data is going to be so late, we're going to change that approach. And we're going to work with getting as good of population estimates as we can. And for most jurisdictions, I think we're going to have residents start drafting maps, knowing that they're estimated numbers, knowing they don't need to get precise population and quality because they won't be right in the end. But get people talking about how do you put neighborhoods together into your approximate districts, roughly how close are your current lines, that kind of stuff we can get going. And then the other big issue we faced, just having been through this so many times with people drawing maps, is it's a lot of work to draw a map. And we didn't want someone to have to draw a map using estimated data and then tell them, oh, you have to redraw your map once the official data comes out. So we actually are partnering with some of the map vendors to say, how do we automate that so that once the official data comes out, we just run a little program and all the maps the residents have drawn are automatically updated to the new population data. So we're already jumping on that, trying to get ahead of it so that we can, as you were both saying, hold those preliminary hearings, get people involved, get people talking to their neighbors and their community groups about what makes sense for the city long before the official census data is released. So we think it'll give a pretty robust process, even if it's a bigger communications challenge to explain the differences.
So that's interesting. I want to just explore that a little bit more too. So I think what I'm hearing you say is you would allow people to draw maps using some estimation data effectively, and then you would replace that estimated data with real data, and the people wouldn't have to redraw their maps, but they might go back to their map and see that it's now out of balance because the assumptions were wrong, and then they can tweak some lines to try to get it back into balance as opposed to starting from scratch with redrawing a map. Is that an accurate description?
Exactly. We'll let them use those 3 weeks that Chris was talking about earlier to just fine tune their maps and make the final corrections rather than having to redraw the map again from scratch.
Right. So, and one thing I want to drill in there too, because from a comms perspective, this is super important to me, but I know it is from your demographic experience. And Chris, I think there's even at least some legal benefits of empowering the public to do some of this work on their own, but you could comment on that. You're the attorney. The idea here is, unlike a lot of other public policy issues we try to tackle, if you're building a huge capital improvement program, putting a massive piece of pipe in the ground, you can't really go through a simulation with your public on how to build that and minimize the amount of impact on the surrounding neighborhoods, right? There's not tools necessarily to do that. There's tools to explain it, but
that would be cool.
It would be cool. It would be cool. And there are some interesting, well, that's a whole other conversation. There are some interesting tools out there, but in this particular case, it's one of the few public policy areas, kind of like some of the budget allocation tools that exist out there, where you empower the public to say, great, you don't like our solution, please come up with the solution that you think works. The map drawing tools are really a unique case where you can go to the public and say, I'm a demographic expert. We have a legal expert on here. We're trying to communicate with you and help you understand what's going on. But ultimately, we're going to empower you so that if you don't like these maps, you can come up with your own maps and submit them just like every other professional, right? The map that NDC draws is sitting right next to the map that's drawn by John Q. Public and going through the scrutiny and review. Which is a very empowering thing for the public. It's a great way to engage with them because they actually get hands-on. Yeah. And frankly, I think losing that in the communications process is a real loss. So having a methodology to use estimating data is really helpful. And then ultimately, it's a great kind of response when people say this whole process is rigged. You're not taking into my consideration when you're drawing maps. And the answer is, absolutely, we're letting everybody draw a map, right? We're empowering you to do this. Please be a partner with us in this process.
Right. I mean, I think there are three advantages. Well, I'm sure there's more, but there's three main ones. One, under the new state law, you have to let people draw maps and submit them. So first advantage, you're complying with the law, right? That's basic. But even if they hadn't adopted those rules, I think there are still two advantages, right? One, if you make someone sit down and actually draw a map, they start to understand the trade-offs that go with this, right? If it's all in the abstract, a lot of people are complaining about, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Without understanding what the ripple effects are throughout the rest of the map and how other problems it can create, and that you have to make those trade-offs. So I think it's useful in that respect. And it's also, I think, useful, historically, we would have public hearings and people would come in and they would talk about, what they thought should be happening and what their communities of interest are. But the testimony and the commentary was so generic or vague that it wasn't really actionable in any particular way. They would just kind of talk in very general terms. They wouldn't tell you, what's your neighborhood? Where is it? What streets does that include? Now they can sit down, they can draw those lines and show you explicitly what they're talking about when they say you should keep this area together, or, and so it makes it easier, even if it ends up being a map drawn by Doug, he has more input and understanding of what the community thinks that those areas are that should be preserved than was necessarily the case before. And I should say, we've had a few processes where the final map that got adopted was a public map. It happens.
Yeah, and let me add to that too. A fourth benefit, this one's fairly personal for the city council members and school board members and other electeds, is normally there's a proposal that comes to the elected board, and the residents stand up and say, yes, I like it, or no, I hate it. And most of them tend to stand up and say, no, I hate it. This is an unusual process in that if they don't like it, they can fix it. So that it's nothing beats being an elected official saying, okay, I hear you about what you don't like about this map, fix it to the resident. and the residents often, sitting right down and doing it. So we've been in many meetings where, the usual gadflies that are no, no, no on everything actually stand up and say, this is hard. I tried to draw a map and I couldn't beat map X, so go with map X, and I appreciate the tough part. So nothing beats being able to say to the complaining resident, fix it yourself. You have the power now.
Well, and my observation in engagements that I've done with you, Doug, is, there is significant time taken in the community meetings to show people how to use the software, to answer their questions. There's technical support available to help those people work through the process and use the tools. It is a simplified tool set, but it is not dead simple, right? Like, it does take effort and some thoughts and some trickery to manage it all, but ultimately it's usable. And there is effort and support put into helping the public engage in this process. It's not just like you shove a URL across the internet to them and say, help yourself, good luck with that, and then you're, peace out, right? It's a much more involved process to empower that public. Yeah,
and one of the nice things is, I mentioned we partner with these software vendors a lot, and we've been working with them for years to try to make these tools better and better. And I am happy to say the main tool we use the most, which generally is the best bang for the buck, is from a company called Caliper. And their product this year is actually greatly improved from just a year ago. It now has built-in help and little tips through it. So even folks that a year ago went through exactly what you're talking about. We used to start our training session saying this product is hard to use, accept that and move on. Now it's actually much easier to use. And the big thing they did is that you now have a pull-down menu for English, Spanish, Vietnamese, or Mandarin. So it's now a multilingual tool for the first time ever. So the tools are still powerful and difficult, but they're getting better.
And I think one thing that will come up as part of this discussion too is there are populations who don't have direct access to a computer, and that may even be more exacerbated on COVID-19. Theoretically, it is URL based. They could go to a library and use a library computer if they need to get internet access as well. A part of that process, there are still paper maps that are an option that can be done, and obviously there's calculations involved and some more manual work that it takes to get that done, and less experimenting, I think, with map drawing. So those are part of the process too, that will be part of any rigorous process with the map drawing. In fact, I'm sure, Chris, from a legal perspective, when it says you have to give them the chance to draw maps, the paper maps are part of that process if that's the only option that's available. And those also are provided with updated data and with in different languages, I believe, Doug, for the appropriate languages in a given jurisdiction where that work is happening, correct?
Yeah, and this is a big challenge for folks is some jurisdictions, not ones that we work with, but some jurisdictions just kind of print out a map and stick it out there and say draw on it kind of thing, which is better than nothing, but it's limited. We've been refining these tools for 35 years. We still flash around a LA Times story from the original Pomona districting back in the around 1990 or so, where we actually put out maps that are customized for this purpose to each jurisdiction. Because I've seen maps put out for the residents where the units are supposed to use cross the freeway and things like that. It's like, well, most residents will want the lines to stop at the freeway. Your tools have to enable that. So it is a challenge, and they are tricky to put together, but we've had a ton of success with those too. Because you're right, some people don't have internet access or don't have good, fast internet access. And we still get a lot of people that just don't want to bother with a computer. They just want to sketch out their map, and I still love it. We get these sheets in where people have drawn their district, and here are the little numbers written on the side that they've added them up by hand to make sure they have the right populations in them. And power to them, and that works.
Yeah. All right. So we're talking about all this, and it is 2021. We just survived 2020. We are still in the middle of a pandemic. Still, council meetings and board of supervisors meetings and school district meetings are being run on Zoom and in virtual environments. COVID-19, as we expect or anticipate, it's likely to have an impact on this process. I think it's a little vague, particularly as we're talking here, and this timeline is getting further pushed into September, October, November. I'm not certainly going to sit here and predict where we're going to be at that point. Right now, Chris, my understanding is that legally, under Governor Newsom's orders, theoretically, you could be executing these meetings in a virtual format or over Zoom. We don't know if that executive order is going to remain in place in time, but can we talk a little bit about how COVID-19 may be affecting the community engagement process here?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's going to be a challenge for sure. I would be shocked if that emergency order is repealed before the end of the year, right? I think that virtual meetings are going to be an option and probably a widely used option for a while. Emergencies don't get repealed for a long time as a rule. But, I will say that a possible silver lining of the delay of the census, and I should say, all else being equal, I would just assume it not happen because it's going to be a mess. But if you're looking for the silver lining, it's that we're going to be doing all of this in probably the fall of this year. By that time, you'll probably still have all of those virtual meetings, but you might still at least have an option for people to show up in person. You may have city council chambers open. Maybe it's 25% capacity. Maybe it's full capacity. Who knows? But I think the further we get through the year, the more likely it seems to be that at least there will be some possibility of having people participate live if they want to, while still preserving the opportunity. I think for a lot of people, the virtual option is actually kind of nice. They can do it from their couch at home and just jump on when it's time and not have to devote a whole night to it. So, and the other kind of related to that, the fact that the new law requires the hearings to be conducted at a specific time, agendized and conducted at a time that's announced in advance, instead of kind of when we get to it on the agenda, depending on what happens in the hours that lead up to it. I think that's going to help too.
Yeah. And I do want to emphasize that, which is one of the surprises that's come out of doing all these hearings in the COVID era, is people actually find it useful. And the interesting twist is, yes, there are people that can't wait to get back to in person, but those are the folks that show up for every meeting. We've actually tapped into a new population that previously, didn't have childcare, or, they couldn't bring their kids and have their kids run around, the council chambers. But now by Zoom, their kid can be eating dinner across the table from them, and they can participate fully in the meeting without having to get a babysitter, without having to worry about what their kid's doing or getting their kid to bed. So it has opened up a door for a lot of people that hopefully will keep open. It does present a huge logistical challenge for jurisdictions to be able to have Zoom participation while also having a live meeting. And
yes,
those requests are coming. And so hopefully the jurisdictions are anticipating it, but I know a lot of them are not. So that will be a challenge. We work and provide the video production services for a couple of council meetings where they are in this hybrid environment. City of Fullerton is an example of one of those, and it's a engineering marvel at times, it seems, to actually make those things work and work successfully. It's always much easier if everybody just stays on Zoom and uses a singular platform. And Zoom has some great tools for multi-language support and obviously sharing. And I would generally observe, to your point, Doug, that we've seen a big increase in overall community engagement, or at least lurkers out there that are watching more or kind of tuning in because it's a lot easier. And cities have also been practicing this format, right? They've been practicing getting on Zoom calls and working with each other. So building that kind of bone and muscle strength around those virtual meetings has really, I think, helped public agency organizations generally look at how we might engage the public in a different way. That's gotten more exposure. And in my mind, if I could have my dream scenario, it's we do some online stuff, we do some in-person stuff, we try to accommodate various people in this scenario, because you are probably going to get different constituencies based upon doing in-person versus live versus hybrid. And if the goal is to hear from everybody, that might be some of the best options to do. Not to mention the fact that generally speaking, it's just a lot cheaper to do the virtual stuff, right? It's very easy. The travel costs are significantly reduced, and it's logistically easy for everybody else that's participating in the process too. So yeah, with our Santa Barbara County project, they had actually planned to just go around to the different city council chambers because they're all wired for broadcasting all that. Yeah. And now we're looking at, we actually are going to need two big screens. One big screen that will show the maps, and the other screen that will show the people who are commenting via Zoom. Mm-hmm. And this is going to be most of those small town chambers won't be big enough for that. So they're having to revisit where they're going to hold those hearings.
Exactly. I mean, that's and what you're actually turning around and then streaming out to the rest of the world becomes an interesting question in terms of how are you getting the broadcast from within the chamber versus the person that's coming in on Zoom. And I mean, like I said, we got some super hardcore AV nerds on our team that have worked on some of these things, but it's a big challenge. Definitely a big challenge. Definitely. All right. A couple more questions and we'll wrap up here. How does staff, I mean, this is a dynamic environment. For example, Doug, you shared the news that the census data is going to be delayed and what this kind of cascading effect is on timeline. How do staff stay, if you're the city clerk of a small school district in the Central Valley or a special, a cemetery district up in the Bay Area, like how do you keep track of what's going on with this space?
Chris, do you want to take that first? On the legal side? Okay. Well, to be honest, Ryder, I'm going to steal an idea from you. We actually are just starting up. We haven't sent out any issues yet, but we're just starting up our own email and newsletter list for our clients and those who are interested in this topic, where we'll be sending out updates. This is, again, part of the reaction to the latest delay in the census data is what can you do? But I think, signing up for, like our NDC information to get the demographer side of this, staying in touch with Tripepi Smith, on the communication side of this and the engagement side of this. There, as Chris mentioned at the very beginning, there are very, very few folks that do this work, on the legal side, on the demographic side, or even on the communication side. And so, we'll all be spending an enormous amount of our time figuring out how to manage all this and how to make the best of the situation we're in, and then updating all of our clients on that. So I think reaching out to folks now, and even if someone's not ready to sign a contract, they can tell us that they're interested and get on our list. We're happy to get those communications going.
Yeah, Chris, you got any other comments?
This will be very dynamic.
Yeah, Chris, you got any other comments you want to make on that? Otherwise, I got a couple things I'll throw out there too.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I think Doug's right. I think now is the time to really be reaching out to the people who do this and getting information from them. I've done, I don't know, 6 or 8 various presentations in various forums for city clerks and county councils and you name it. And there's a lot of information out there if you're looking for it. And I think the people who do this work are available to talk and happy to share information. So.
Yeah. Well, obviously something like this format here helps provide at least some update and a roadmap, although this is being recorded in early February. Therefore, by the end of February, some of the news is going to change on us, right?
That's right.
Second thing I would generally observe is, local government. If there's one thing about California local government, there's an association for everything, right? So there is a California City Clerks Association. There's a City Clerk Working Group that's partnered up with the League, which I suspect is affiliated with the City Clerk Association. There's, I'm sure, county clerks or some division within CSAC and within the Special District Association as well. So for all those kind of major big 3 that represent local government, the local government agencies. All of them are probably organizing groups and having conversations. I know, Doug, one of your team members and I were recently on the League of Cities City Clerk monthly call having a discussion. We brought up a number of these points and issues just to advise them of it. So certainly they should be looking at their association groups and getting involved with those to stay up to date. Email lists, very helpful. I would also just say, especially for the clerks that are maybe newer to this, or this is all, like everything they're hearing today is new. The Rose Institute of State and Local Government hosted a virtual conference, a one-day virtual conference in September that covered a lot of territory and got into some real meaty issues, had some great speakers, including both Doug and Chris as speakers, and really had a lot of great content. And that is available for folks. I believe it's at this point, it's still a de minimis fee of like $50 for 6 hours of solid content that would be really great for anybody who wants to do a ramp-up course. They can go in and watch all the recorded Zoom sessions and get up to speed very quickly on these issues and best position themselves, I think, to find the right demographer, find the right outreach firm, find the right legal counsel, make some decisions, advise their senior management staff and counsel properly to advance the ball on these issues. So I would definitely encourage people to in fact, we'll put a link in the YouTube section on this video when we post it, linking out to that Rose Institute URL, or I'll have my editor insert a URL on the screen here that will just pop up through the magic of post-production editing. He'll give you a chance to see that linkage and be able to follow that URL. All right, and then last but not least, I just want to cover one other item, which is we talked a lot about city clerks and city staff and their involvement. Where do elected officials fit into all this, right? What's their role in this process?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, by default, at least, they're the decision makers. The staff and the consultants and our office and yours, we're all working to make sure that we're developing options that ultimately are providing choices to the elected officials, right? I mean, there's an exception if you would decide to adopt an independent commission, and that's a different case. But by default, the maps that get adopted are adopted as an ordinance or a resolution, and so it's up to the city council or the board of supervisors to listen to all of this commentary and then listen to the advice they're getting from their consultants and decide. I've got 15 maps in front of me. Which one makes the most sense? I'm told that all of them sort of meet the criteria that they're required to meet. Now I've got to think, what do I know about this jurisdiction and this town? Based on what I know, which one of these is the most sort of effective for providing representation to the citizens of my city or my county?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add to that too. The really successful members of the community who get their maps adopted are the ones who understand this is a back and forth process, and listen. The elected officials will give initial feedback on the maps, maybe narrow the pool of maps down. And the really successful residents and organizations, the ones that listen to that, and then take that narrow group of maps and submit another round. I always remember when we first did Modesto, a 20-year-old community college kid was just interested. And so he submitted a map, and then the commission held a hearing on it. And he revised it based on that hearing. And then the commission held another hearing and mentioned more thoughts on the map. And he kept responding to the public input and the elected officials' input, or in that case, the commissioner's input. And his map made it to the final two. It's that kind of give and take that happens through this process, perhaps more than any other process, and is an opportunity. But it is ultimately, as Chris said, the successful folks at getting their maps adopted are the ones that realize the elected officials are the ones who had the final vote on this and were ultimately responsible for it.
Yeah. And then would you, I guess on a related point, in terms of elected official involvement in some of clearly they have to sit at the dais for the hearings, but some of the public outreach meetings that are not hearings, but just more about community education, my general sense is it's best if they just kind of take a back seat, let the community be involved and engaged in this process. Don't try to show up or dominate at those meetings or start rendering perspectives on issues and whatnot, but just hold back and let the community do their part. And operate from your position of taking this fresh in, sharing information with the rest of your council members at the dais in your function as a council member or board of supervisors member or, water board member or what have you.
I agree.
It's very true. It's very distracting for the public at these forums to have elected officials. Often we'll have them thank everyone for coming, kick off the hearing and then leave. But otherwise, people, instead of the give and take we're looking for in the meeting amongst different community groups, they end up turning all their attention to the council members present and lobbying that person, essentially. We've also seen elected officials get themselves in trouble. We worked in one city where a council member refused our guidance and insisted on giving a big speech at the beginning because he thought he had seen where the process was going to go, and he tried to shape the discussion to the map he wanted. Well, he miscalculated. And once people drew maps the way he wanted, he realized that put him in with another council member and he wasn't going to get to run for re-election. So he had to show up at the forum 3 weeks later and renounce all of his own statements early on. So they can get themselves in trouble, and they're much better off, letting the public weigh in first, and then, being the elected officials who are ultimately making the decision, not trying to frame it from the beginning. Yeah.
I think related to that point, this kind of speaks to that independent redistricting commission. So a couple things I'll sum up here. It's not, unless your charter requires it, which is possible, you generally are not required to do an independent commission. Right. You can do an independent commission that is actually fully empowered to make a decision on the maps and completely takes it out of the hands of the council, or you can have them do some hybrid model, correct, Chris, where they can lead a process and go through it and be population or kind of John Q. public representative, but ultimately those things ascend to the council for them to make the final decision on adopted maps. Are those accurate descriptions of some of the options that are out there for independent commissions, Chris?
Yeah, there's basically three. There's the pure independent commission that you described. There's sort of a purely advisory commission. So they have hearings or whatever, and they may make recommendations to the council, but they're not binding, and they're just recommendations. And then the hybrid that you talked about is sort of, well, it's a hybrid of the two. It's independent to the extent that it gets to make proposals to the commission or to the council, but the council can only choose among the maps that are proposed to by the commission. So unless there's some legal requirement to make tweaks to it. So, you know, in that case, the hybrid commission can sort of funnel the process and say, you know, yeah, you get to pick, but you have to pick between these two or these three. So there's some independence there, some control. You know, it's a spectrum, right? You know, complete control by the council all the way to none.
And I've had a couple of jurisdictions that have looked at the language for advisory committees and said, well, you know, they can only cover one of the required 4 hearings, so does that really help us very much? And that is how the law reads, but it's not actually how it works, because the council does have to hold 3 hearings. If you have an advisory committee, the advisory committee can hold 1 of the required 4, and then of course do a bunch more. But 2 of those required 3 can be on first reading and second reading of the ordinance. So and the third would then be when the advisory committee reports to the council, and the council takes action on the advisory committee's report. So they do knock out a lot of, you know, the advisory committee can handle all the community forums, can do all the informational meetings and take care of all that. And then the council would just handle the parts that it, of course, has to handle, which is the final vote. People are getting a little intimidated by the fact that the language says the advisory committee can only do 1 of the required 4, but the other 3 are kind of formalities anyways.
And I think one of the other questions that comes up in considering this, and by the way, my sense is based upon, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, the vast majority of local government agencies do not go independent commission at all. They'll run it through their existing board or their existing city council or something like that. Some of the questions that will loom around this are, if I go the independent, like, is that more cost effective? Is it more expensive? What does it take? My general sense of things here is it depends, right? It depends mostly on, usually if you're going to go independent commission route, you're going to have more outreach, more meetings, more time spent staffing those commissioners. They're going to have to go through a ramping curve and process to learn about the nature of the work that they're doing. And then, especially if it's a hybrid, you're ultimately going to have to brief the council on that stuff as well. So there's additional meetings that are likely to come. So typically, you would see a correlation between overall costs of services, whether it's additional internal staff costs or consultant costs. The more you go with an independent commissioner, you have an independent commission function, which isn't to say it's the wrong thing to do. It's just there are certain overhead things that are inherent to any sort of independent commission process that are likely to add additional cost to the process itself.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and just so people understand what we're talking about, when we worked with the Pasadena Unified Independent Commission, the commissioners chose to hold 23 meetings. You know, that's a lot of work. So that's an extreme, but that is where commissions tend to go, is to more hearings than a council would do if the council members had to do it, because the commissioners only have 1 item on their agenda. You know, the councils are busy. Right. There's some other stuff going on impacting cities and schools these days.
Chris and Doug, this has been immensely helpful. Is there anything else that we didn't get a chance to cover today that you want to at least raise a point about or surface some conversation on?
I will add one note, just so, you know, we talked about Claremont and the Rose Institute and how a lot of us in redistricting, including all 3 of us, come out of there. It's worth noting, as we talk about possible need for legislative changes, that actually now the chief counsel for the Assembly Elections Committee and the State Senate Elections Committee on the majority side are both now Claremont McKenna alums as well. So hopefully we can get some fixes to some of these things within the Claremont family. Should make it easier to move those things along.
Go CMC. That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
That actually does, but that actually just reminded me of one other point that I wanted to raise, Doug, because Chris and you've both noted that this is going to be a crunch year, and obviously the timeline slide is going to be a crunch as well. What does that mean for how, like, Doug, you're getting ready for this? And Chris, I don't know. I mean, I assume you're not adding more partners to Nielsen Merksamer, but maybe there's some crunch work you're looking at addressing. But Doug, let's talk about, for you first, how are you getting ready to be able to deal with this deluge so people are not going to be left holding the bag if they're, you know, if NDC's wrapped up doing 400 of these redistrictings in 2021?
Sure. It's one of the reasons we've been around so long is decades ago, the founders of the company figured out this model where we realize we have a busy year of the decade, not a busy time of year.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in 81, 91, 2001, 2011, every decade we've had to do this expansion where we bring in and train new people. And this year, essentially, we're just repeating what we've done before, just on a larger scale. Instead of trying to cover 105, now we're looking to cover, a couple hundred jurisdictions. And so we bring in professors, retired city clerks, retired school superintendents, people who are comfortable in front of an elected body and comfortable talking to the public from that perspective. And then we put them through a big training course. So it's something we've done again and again. It is very tricky and hard to do. We had to learn that it was easier to take people who were comfortable in that audience and train them on redistricting than to take demographers and try to make them comfortable speaking in front of elected bodies. That doesn't work. So it's something we've had to do before. We're just having to scale it up even more this time than before.
All right. Yeah, I was going to say, so you've grown your army of people around in DC pretty significantly over the last year, getting ready and anticipating 2021 being a busy year.
Yes. We had 4. A year ago, we had 4 people. Now we're up to 12 and still growing.
Okay. All right. And Chris, any adjustments you're making at Nielsen Merksamer, or is the nature of the engagement work you have pretty straightforward, makes it easy to absorb?
We're not adding people. I think it's more a function of this practice area is going to be a bigger part of their mix, right? So in a normal, 2016, 2017, I might do a jurisdiction or 2 or 3, and it's part of my broader legal practice. 2021, it's going to be, 95%, right?
Yeah.
And that's true for a number of particularly the litigators in our office, where we all have some experience with it, but this year it's going to be a big chunk of what we do. So.
All right. Well, it's going to be a busy year in 2021. I thank our audience for listening. That's today's report. My thanks to Doug and Chris for joining us today. And from the whole PublicCEO team and myself, Ryder Todd Smith, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Ryder.
We hope you learned something new and inspiring that'll help you in your public service. Remember, PublicCEO has a daily newsletter that is free to those who sign up at PublicCEO.com. If you have feedback, questions, or guest suggestions for PublicCEO Report, please email alex@PublicCEO.com.